Today's meeting, well, every meeting is important. Today's meeting is particularly important because we have a kind of like a pretty heavy agenda here. We'll have Dr. Clinch talk about personal income projection and also other economic indicators that has significant impact on revenue outlook for both FY20 and also beyond. And also the budget office will provide you the latest update on our preliminary projection for FY20 in terms of revenue expenditures and expenditure needs, and also multi-year projections. After that, our finance folks will share with you about debt projections, debt capacity, and debt indicators projections. And the second half of the meeting, we'll start to talk about the report itself on that in terms of what are the major issues or recommendations that people are comfortable to include, or we should, as a committee, include in the report. And by the way, given a very short period of time, we only have about a week to develop a report. So we volunteered some folks from the committee to help us put the report together. And Steve have kindly agreed to lead in that effort. I really appreciate it. Steve is going to go over some of the points for the report and also the process for putting that together. So Dr. Clinch,
Sure. Holly told me because of the snow day, I have to give you a condensed whirlwind tour of the economy. So I'm going to give a little bit of a outlook for national, then Maryland a little bit, and then it's really focusing on Howard County. So those of you who have the slides, I'm going to skip over them real fast. Nationally, what's really important is we're in an expansion, but it's poised in May to become the longest expansion in U.S. history. Inflation is trending upward, which usually makes economists nervous, but the truth is at this point it's kind of good. It means the economy is starting to get to the point where, it should be normally. So the projections nationally are continued economic and employment growth, but slower. And the real issue here is nobody really knows when the recession is going to hit or when the slowdown is going to hit. My personal opinion is we're going to have a slowdown, avoid a recession, but the situation nationally is we have an expansion that's fueled by expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, and that's either going to overheat the economy, causing the Fed to slow things down, or it's going to wear off. The effects won't continue into the future. So it's either going to slow it down or cause a reaction. So just nationally, I think we're poised for a slowdown. If anybody knows what's going to happen in terms of a recession, we're all really unsure at this point. When I gave the slide last year, things were good nationally, but now they're great nationally. Basically, everybody in the nation is growing or expanding. So Maryland, really quick, Maryland is really kind of the problem. The Maryland economy is lagging in growth. Why is that? It's because we're driven by federal employment and federal government spending, which is great. Of the last two recessions, they were both more mild. The 2001 recession barely happened in Maryland. The last recession was was less severe in Maryland because of the strong federal spending. But the federal government isn't growing right now. We had a shutdown, and we may have another round of sequester. So who knows what's going to happen with the federal government? But that is a cause of the slowdown. More importantly, Maryland's business climate is seen as weak. We didn't get Amazon. We're growing more slowly than peer states. Virginia is really growing much more rapidly than us. So the challenges to the Maryland economy is that we're federally government driven and we must diversify, but we have the assets to grow. Universities, educated workforce, R&D based, life sciences. Basically everybody from the Board of Revenues to Moody's is predicting a slowdown. Everybody thinks 2019 is going to be okay, but sometime in the 2020-2021 period, it's going to be either a slowdown or a recession. So that's Maryland, the national economy, in a whirlwind tour. Any questions?
Many, but we'll,
I can throw the world in at this point. But Howard County, in terms of my forecasts, for those of you who've been in the committee for a while, probably getting bored of seeing it. But I really focus on the two most important revenue sources for the county. Now, property taxes, so real estate, and income taxes, so jobs and people and the associated income growth are what drive the county budget. These two taxes account for 72% of all funds and 88, almost 90%, so almost 9 cents on every dollar the county gets in terms of general fund revenues comes from these two sources. So when I'm forecasting personal income, I look at population growth. So what are the people, what's the workforce doing, economic growth, what's the job base doing, how's the real estate market, and that all drives into a personal income forecast. Population growth, I don't need to belabor this. We're the fastest growing county in terms of the rate of population growth over the long term. We far outpaced the state and region in terms of population growth. It's a very desirable place to live. Our county is growing from both the natural increase, so people having babies and having fun having babies, and migration. And we're one of only 9 counties that are growing from both international and domestic migration. And Howard County is attracting a huge base of its population from surrounding counties because of the schools' quality of life issues we have here. One thing that is concerning is that the households moving into the county have lower incomes than the households moving out of the county. That's the kind of the reverse of what happened in the early 2000s, but very normal for our stage of development. We're losing retirees, government high-level workers are moving to lower tax jurisdictions, Delaware, Florida, and gaining, middle-class households that are working. So it's not a disastrous sign, but it's a troubling sign. So the county has very substantial workforce assets, but there are some risks here. We have a high household income. We have the 13th highest household income in the nation, but it actually fell in 2017. We went from being the 2nd highest in the nation to the 13th highest in the nation. We have a high level of workforce participation. That's great for the current tax base, but that means where is the future workforce growth going to come from? We have a highly educated workforce. 31% of Howard County residents, of employed Howard County residents have a graduate degree. We have a lot of professional workers. We're between 2 job markets. So if Washington's growing slow, we can send more workers to Baltimore. So we're well positioned, but the issue is we're having lower income growth. And again, I'm sorry for doing this fast, but Holly's promised me that she's got a hook and going to pull me off if I don't go too. But the other warning sign here is labor force and employed resident is growing more slowly. So the top line here is Maryland, the blue, or is Howard County, the blue line is Maryland. We're growing much more rapidly in the long run than the state, but in the last year, our workforce has grown by less than 1%. So what is happening here? We have full workforce participation, low unemployment, so we're having low growth in workers. In terms of economic growth, Larry is doing his job. We're one of the fastest growing places in the state. The blue line is Maryland. We're outpacing the nation and both competitor regions. We have the highest growth rate and second highest number of jobs added since the trough of the recession. So we have a diversified economy. I won't go into this, but we have things that range from high-skilled jobs to professional technical services, where a lot of the growth has been, but also middle-wage jobs, middle-skilled jobs, transportation, wholesale, manufacturing, construction are all growing. So Howard County, despite its reputation as kind of an upper-income suburban community, has a strong diversified job base, which again is good and cushions us from future economic problems. Now the issue is that federal procurement is a key driver in Howard County. We had a government shutdown this year. Sequestration is possible again in the future. And the growth in the county is, in my opinion, very much driven by federal procurement. So federal procurement during the last period of sequester declined rapidly. So this is DOD and non-DOD, and then we've gotten back to pre-sequestration levels. This was an aberration. I think these were construction contracts. So we have a huge base of federal contracting. These are federal purchases going on in the county. The good news again is that it's in professional services and R&D, and driven by high-tech companies like AT&T and Northrop Grumman, and Hopkins APL is about 50%. The bad news is I don't see a future strong growth that we saw in the last 4 or 5 years in government procurement in the county. So again, we're having good population growth, but slowing. Good employment-based growth, especially for workers or for jobs in the county, but slowing residential workforce-based growth. We have a residential real estate recovery from the recession. So when you look at the median price, it's going up. I love this slide, but it's too complex. I guess I'll tone it down next year. But the prices are up well above pre-recession levels. Inventory is trending down. Units sold is trending up. So we're in a real estate recovery, but it slowed down very much in 2018, and we don't really know why that happened. Is it supply? Is it that there's a general cooling down of the market? Permits are trending down. Very chunky. So these are downtown Columbia, I think. So the permitting activity is kind of trending down. And there was a huge drop in 2017 in non-residential permitting activity. So this is a real problem, because are we going to create the space to drive the employment growth in the county that we need to diversify our tax base? So in summary, very quickly, Howard County's outlook is shaped by a variety of things. The Maryland economy is slow growing, and we really can't do much better than the state. Short and long-term prognosis for federal spending is uncertain at best. At best, we're going to have slow growth. The national recovery is driven by expansionary spending and monetary policies, and as I say, this is either going to cause the economy to overheat or the effects are going to wind down over time. And there are local constraints on income growth. We've had a decline in median household income, and nobody can really explain why that happened, I don't think. Workforce is already at full capacity. We have high labor force participation and low unemployment. Our workforce is growing slowly. We're in a full real estate recovery, but at vote, we're going to talk about on Thursday. So there are continued reasons when we did this last year for calling for caution. I believe even though the national economy is doing great, all we read is the stock market doing better than December, the job market's doing great. We still need to be cautious, in my opinion, in the next 2 years in the county. So really, I'm calling for about 3% growth going forward, compared to 4% growth during most of the recovery in personal income. And again, why am I calling for this going down? When you look at the long-term growth in personal income, I looked at it relative to population and per capita. So how much of the effect is by population growth, and how much of it is by income growth in the of the residents? When you look at the long run, it's about 25% from population growth, 75% from income growth. But in the recovery from the recession, income growth has slowed and population contribute more to the growth. And as we know with APFO and slower employment growth, population growth can't continue as rapidly in the county. So the potential needs or impacts of APFO really need to be considered in our forecast going forward. And the other thing that Holly really asked me to do was model in a slowdown. So I put in a slowdown in 2020. In the report, there's an alternative table to this, and that has things doing slightly worse, going from 3 to the high 2s for income. I'll skip the last slide because it's really just kind of talking, leaving a little bit more cautious than Moody's for the county. And this is my accuracy for the last 2 years. But questions? Too quick drinking from a fire hose. Sorry, but did I do it fast enough?
Thank you. I think it is fast and very comprehensive at the same time. One quick question, if I can start, is the employment growth on that. Both the county and Maryland food has been forecasted for the next few years, and the worst and very minor. That's primarily attributed to the fact that labor market is so high. On the zone of this.
Well, migration. One of the things all the rating services for. Maryland isn't really gaining as much population as much. So employment is at full capacity at the state level, less than the nation for the first time, but the workforce participation is high. So the question is, we're also not getting the population influx that we got in prior decades. The question is what's driving the Maryland economy going forward, and I could talk for hours about that, which you wouldn't let me do. But the Maryland economy is really sucking wind right now. We're, the slow growth in federal spending is really hurting the Maryland economy. We do a quarterly business climate survey. Businesses are more optimistic than the past. I think the state's a better place to do business with than the past, but we're not really translating into growth. The question is, federal government and certain government policies, I think, crowded out a lot of private sector growth, where Virginia has much more balanced growth between private sector and government growth. And Maryland is really suffering from this, and that is going to hurt all the jurisdictions, especially a place like Howard County that's smack dab in the middle of Maryland. A place like Montgomery County can benefit to some greater degree from the growth going on in Virginia. There's going to be Amazon workers residing in Montgomery County and driving to Virginia. There are going to be fewer. There's going to be some Amazon workers here in Howard County, but many fewer. So the question is, for that, I think the state is sucking wind, and until the state grows, a place like Howard County, smack dab in the middle of the island, is going to have slower growth. Economists argue for years about what drives growth. Is it jobs or people? Do people come to get jobs? Yeah, I'm firmly in the fence that when your economic base grows, you get more people, and it becomes a reinforcing cycle. We're kind of broke that cycle in Maryland recently.
do have one question. Is there any differentiation between the difference, or the trends at least, in the small business growth versus larger enterprises in terms of business growth and employment?
I didn't look at it at the state level. I think it's been pretty uniform. Maryland is very biased. Maryland's economy is pretty biased towards larger business because of the federal contractor base. But we always have strong growth, so I don't have it for the county, didn't look at it. Yeah, I would just hypothesize both are doing, as well as could be expected.
What is the level unemployment rate?
2.7%, give or take.
And what is it trending?
It's been below 3. We're at full employment. Really, basically, if the trend has been gradual reduction, but you can't get much more than 2.7%. Basically, economists again argue this point. None of us agree. Darius probably wouldn't agree with me. We were both taught by different people what full employment is. Whatever number it is, 2.7% is better than full employment. So we're at full employment. Anybody who really wants a job, generally speaking, can find it. And the trend is not. It can't go much lower than this. I've never, nobody's ever seen it lower than this. And barring, some adverse shock to the economy, it's not going to go higher. So we're going to be in the 3s. Right? So again, sorry for the speed. Oh, no.
Just very quickly, you mentioned one slide back there, someplace you talked about, I think it was Maryland needs to diversify its economy. The tools are there, but the steps haven't been taken. Have you talked about that at any level, whether Howard County
economy is doing fine, frankly. I mean, we have a huge federal contractor base. We're getting corporate headquarters. We're having a diversified job base growth, which I talked about. It is in the report. At the state level, there are certain tax and regulatory policies that put us at a disadvantage. And sure, yeah, I gave a speech. I mean, I'm very depressed about this issue. I gave a speech in Annapolis about 2 weeks ago, and I realized that I gave the same speech 27 years ago when I started in Maryland, and things have only gotten worse. So yes, does the state know what it has to do? We have Excel Maryland. We're investing in the universities, but are we doing it? No, frankly. I can say that I don't work for the state very much. And I certainly won't now. But no, the state knows what it has to do. It's making some investments. I mean, one of the criticisms I make is I do national work with, we spun out of the Talent group that I work with. Who do you think spends more on technology-based economic development? And yeah, I know John, the TEDCO person is here. Arkansas or Maryland?
Yeah, I'm going to guess Arkansas.
They put more money in their TEDCO than we put in our TEDCO. So, does Maryland know what it has to do? Yeah, it's known it for 25 years. As I said, I gave the same speech I gave in Annapolis 2 weeks ago, 27 years ago. So they obviously know, and there's smart people, me, Darius, telling them what to do. The question is, why aren't they doing it? And I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think the administration's done well. I don't know why we don't get together. Howard County is well positioned for growth. We're going to do better than the state for a variety of reasons. One, we have the best educated workforce in the state of Maryland. Two, we have one of the better locations in Maryland. Sure, I'd rather be next to Virginia, but we can't move to Cole County, west and south. We have available real estate for employment growth. So we have Gateway coming on. We have all the things. The only problem with the county going forward is the lack of kind of a central place. So in terms of patterns of economic development that I'm seeing nationally, you're having a more trend towards urban development, putting places like Howard County at a disadvantage. So we really have a need to create a space. Is downtown Columbia that space? Maybe. I don't know enough. I know a lot of my neighbors' kids have moved there and not moved to Baltimore. But we really do need that kind of innovation district kind of vibe or urban vibe. Places like Frederick are working to do it and have done actually a really good job, of doing it. So.
Rich, can you comment on?
I thought I said enough nice things.
You did. You did. Thank you very much. But comment about NSA, because they don't show up in a lot of the federal data, and so much of our not only direct employment but contractor employment is related to NSA, we go to cyber. I mean, are we less subject to those federal spending you know?
Yes, so the answer is about 14% of the Howard County workforce works for the federal government. Of about half of those work for Fort Meade, give or take, based on that analysis. Whatever happens with sequestration or defense government or government slowdowns in spending is going to hit, Fort Meade less than the nation as a whole. But when you look at the other half of those workers, a lot of them work for government contractors broadly. Everything from HUD to APA to those are going to get impacted more. And you look at the contractor tail in Maryland. Many of our employees commute to professional services jobs in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and DC, and they're going to be hurt. So the answer is yes, we're better off. But we're going to take half of the driver of the Maryland economy and slow it down. And we're already growing more slowly than the nation. So, but again, Howard County is well positioned. Workforce, real estate, location. So, anything else? I must have done my job. I've either shocked you or, so, all right,
Thank you.
Sure.
So one thing I was a little bit bothered is the median household income there. We have been number 2 in the nation for a long time, if I recall.
In the top 5 in the nation, yes, in the top 5 since I've been on the committee. I'm wondering if it's a measurement issue. I'd like to see it for another year. Because you're not seeing the numbers in income.
It's really, for us, it really doesn't cost much. It's usually stay in the top. At least in the past 2 years, that's really 3 or 2 for.
We've been in the top 5 for as long as I've been on the committee. I've been on the committee for 2 administrations.
When you share that with Jeff's data about the type of households that are growing, it's more apartments than single family.
Correct.
And do you think that would be a factor?
Yeah, but when you look at other places, Fairfax, that are still high and not falling, they also have. Fairfax ran out of land long before we did. We haven't run out of land yet. They have. So the question is, closer into DC is probably more the driver. We're 13th in the nation. There are 15,000 counties in the nation, give or take. 13th ain't bad. The question is, why is it falling? And I would say, yes, we have a different mix of real estate, as Jeff has talked about. We also don't have the overheated job market of DC right next to us that the Virginia jurisdictions have.
The fall in income, is that 1 year that we fell in much, or is this been
1 year.
trending a little
It
bit
was
down?
the 2017 numbers from the Census Department fell. And that is an estimate from Census. We liked using it when it had a second, but now that we're 13, we're going to question it. But it's an estimate from Census based with small area income and population estimates.
So it could be like a whole bunch of people who are maxed out on the GS scale, all retired, right? And then
Moved out of the
Changing demographics of that count. Quick question though, is it, we fell from, I think you said from 2 to 13, but how far was it dropped when the actual dollars? Because sometimes the actual dollars is not that big.
It wasn't that big. It was, I don't have all these numbers in my head, but they're in the report. Well, fell from 119,000 to 112,000 rounding.
Okay.
So 7,000 decline in, about 5% decline, give or take. Again, in measured personal income, and there's, remember there's bounds of that, there are estimates of the error and other things. So again, unless this is a long-term trend, I'm not worried. What we lost was bragging rights, not real. And there was growth from 112 to 119, so it's not that income fell. It just didn't, other places grew more rapidly than we did.
I think the point is more like it's still growing, it's just the relatively pace with others and also our comparative competitiveness there. It's just kind of a signal on that, because in the past many years we stay in the top maybe. I mean, you kind of fall out of the top 10 for a while.
For as long as I've been looking.
Anyway, so I'll start on the revenue and the county fiscal update there, and I'll call it Nikki from the debt and investment manager. We'll talk about the debt indicators here. The first slide here, if you recall, during our first meeting here in the committee, I talked about the county's history of revenue, how the budget has been slowing down And assessable base used to be very strong in income tax, and those has entered a moderate growth period. And this is another way to look at that. This is the county's general fund actual revenue growth. And again, in the past 2 decades, the first 7 to 8 years, on average annual growth is about $45 million, about 7.4% on average. So again, very strong at that point. And the following several years is 35, 36 million, or close to 4%. And the most recent 3 years, our average is about $20 million, or close to 2%. So again, it's just showing the overall trend. Again, we're still growing every year in general, but the pace of that has been half in 1 decade and then almost half again. So it's just that we are entering a moderate growth period, kind of which much in tone with Dr. Clinch said earlier. Things are still fine, except it's very moderate, it's solid, steady, but not a high-paced growth anymore. So the county's revenue growth, based on all the information we have today, we're making a preliminary projection of about 2.7% of growth for fiscal year 20, which is about 30 million. That actually is better than what we experienced the last couple of years, and there's a reason. Property tax, as you all know, this is a tax that's number one income of the county. And we pretty much rely on the State Department Assessment Taxation's information because they assess all the properties in the county and they make a projection on that. The number is very solid, essentially tied to the official number on that. And as we mentioned earlier, that again, these days, property tax, property assessable base experience very moderate growth in any typical year. So for FY20 is 2.3%. The next couple of years will be anywhere between 2.5% to 3%. That's my projection the next few years. Income tax, actually, it's about 3.7% projected, or about 3.2% from FY19 estimate level. FY19, there's a couple elements to mention that is we already have about first quarter collection coming, which is actually doing better. It's not because of fundamental part. Fundamental part is right on target. It's because a rebouncing of reconciliation distribution. Every year, the state wouldn't know for sure until 1 or 2 years after the actual tax year to know what actually belonged to your county because of people's late filing and final reconciliation of the actual tax there. Before that, they kind of make projections about each county, how much you should have. Then later, they'll have reconciliation. Some years, they found they overpaid county, and sometimes they found like they short us on that. So that reconciliation is bounced back because prior year, same time, we have a significant dip, and at that point, we don't know whether it's one time or ongoing, so now we bounce back to some extent. However, that's partially mitigated by other factors. One is the federal shutdown. As you all know, that the federal government has the longest shutdown recently, and we got some data from State Controller's office that in Howard County, about 6% of the household has families that are civilian employee of the federal government, then theoretically should be impacted by the shutdown. And also, the state doesn't have great data on procurement. Nobody has at this point. But the general rule of thumb is 1.8 to 1 for contractors versus employment. So that's obvious. It's not a very accurate base to make projection, but it's safe to believe that between contractors as well as direct employment, the county has probably roughly 1/7 of the family likely being impacted there. Some of them will get the feedback later, but others probably get lost permanently. So for that, we don't have accurate data, but could be anywhere between $3 to $5 million of loss. The other thing, the stock market has been very volatile recently. That could impact estimate income. For fiscal year 20, as Dr. Clinch mentioned earlier, that there might be some impact more like in calendar year 2020 rather than this year in terms of potential economic downturn. So for our forecast, we assume most of FY20 is a normal year for income tax, except at the tail end or last quarter of fiscal year 20, we're using a small slowdown. So as a result, income tax represents 3.2% of growth from estimate 19 level. Recordation tax, this is the transaction tax here, similar to the transfer tax here. And year to date, both transfer and recordation tax, we have seen some slide of part of the reason is housing market is basically cooling down. We look at the one set of data of the transaction last year. It's actually total home sales in Howard County dropped by 6.5% from the prior year. The price still have a little bit of increase, on average 1.5% growth, but in general, you see things has been softening. In the past 3 months in a row, I think we have seen both transaction and home price has been dropping. So that's part of the reason we're beating it, just a minor drop for our liquidation tax forecast. License and permits, again, it has been trending down because the economic development has been, the development permits has been slowing down. One piece of good news is highway use revenue. Throughout the history, the state has been cutting that to almost non-existent. And then FY20, actually, there's one piece of good news, it's 1 point some million higher than last year. So that's something to be happy about. Also, our investment income expected to grow, although that's a relatively small number because of the market. One thing to let everybody know that we're still at the stage collecting more data because we don't have second quarter income tax, and also state general assembly decision wouldn't be available until April, so there's still a lot of unknowns there. But at this point, we're ready to show this preliminary projection for 20. So what does that mean with that level of revenue growth of about $30 million? That means we have a gap of between $130 to $140 million, but depending on whether we're affecting the updated state aid to the school system, which will offset part of the original request. So if you look at the request side, the total request of expenditure is $171 million. That includes superintendent's request of $134 million increase. The reason is 134, not 123, is because last year, if you recall, the county's appropriation to the school system include $11.2 million one-time funding from the use of county's own fund balance. So to replenish that money requires a new funding of $11.4 million. And obviously, our other education entities have significant needs as well. And also, we have to pay the debt service, which grow these days between 10 to 12 million each year on average. And also to pay our retiree health benefits, and also multiple office leases there to facilitate the strategic moves there, such as the nonprofit center, innovative center, and courthouse. These are all new funding needed there. And also the rest of the county agencies need some support as well on that. So everything combined looks like we have a huge deficit there. So recently, we had a meeting with, a really good meeting with representative from the school system and also the Board of Ed. It's about talking about the school's budget on that. I know, by the way, the Board of Ed today is going to review budget and have a final proposal. The number is going to change from the superintendent request. So one thing to refresh people's memory is that the superintendent's original request was really high. If you recall, I recall the first meeting I mentioned that it's probably equivalent of raising each family's property tax by over $1,000 for education because of that. That's also historically the second highest in the past decade. And the request about maintenance effort amount is more than double the total above maintenance efforts amount the county put in the past 10 years together. So we asked the school system to provide us 2 scenarios. One is the maintenance scenario, the other is above maintenance scenario, and both scenarios provide priority ranking with categorical breakdown so we understand what kind of service can be supported, what kind of priorities. All things are not equal. So I'm sure the hundreds, some $1 million is not everything is as urgent or as critical, although I'm sure there's needs behind each of them there. So that's one thing we want to make sure we have. And also for maintenance effort scenario, once you school last year one time, all the resources combined, including county, state, and the school's own resources, represent $33 million increase or 3.9% growth. So talking about multi-year revenue projections there, if we don't put in actual impact yet, we're still working closely with the consultant on that. Then the next several years, we are looking at anywhere between 2.7 to 2.9% growth. For folks who were here last year, this is slightly lower than before. Last year, we were roughly 3.5-ish, 3.3 to 3.5% growth there. This is to reflect the general reading of the future from all the economic report as well as the county's own actual experience estimated that we need to put a little more prudence there, especially because the potential possibly mild recession that's likely to happen in the next couple of years. So property tax at this point, we're looking at 2.5 to 3% growth per year. Income tax there, we're looking at 2.5% in fiscal year 21, followed by a bounce back of 3.4% in future years, largely matching Dr. Lynch's projections here. So overall, as I mentioned earlier, 2.7 to 3%, that's not strong, but still solid. However, if you compare that to the expenditure side, you see a huge gap beginning in FY20 because the $134 million gap we just mentioned earlier, but all the way and becoming bigger and bigger the gap. The reason is that the revenue, as I said earlier, is slightly less than 3% on average in any given year, but expenditure typically are around 4.5%, and that's based on the very preliminary projection of needs by all education entities together with accounting agency and accounting debt service and other projections there. So what we're facing is pretty challenging scenarios here, and part of that is just structural, meaning that even if we don't expand for service, just to keep the existing service there, the cost is going to be higher in any given year, but also at the same time with population growth and demographic change, the demands will continue to be there for all kinds of service. So capital budget, the challenge is not necessarily better. We also have a pretty big gap there. If you look at the history, last 4 years for reference here, the county is authorized GO bond each year based on our capital budget is $93 to $97 million, average about 95, and which is actually already slightly higher than what the committee recommended in the past. In the past 4 years, the committee has been recommending anywhere between $75 to $90 million here. And the reality is because there's so much projects going on, we need to keep it going, and the community have lots of needs, we end up actually approving higher than that. For FY20, what is the level requested due from everybody? It's $232 million. That's about 2.5% of what actually has been approved each year in the past few years there. And the school system alone is represents $17 million request on that. So based on historical level of available funds, the gap is $137 million, meaning we have to cut probably 60 to 70% of all the requests on that. And obviously, all those have supporters, all those projects have stakeholders. We have to work very hard with everybody to prioritize on that because clearly we don't have the $232 million to do that. And again, there are also competing needs there. We acknowledge that from the committee, obvious education, higher education, library, and also the roads. And you hear Jim Morgan, our DPW director here, talk about the road resurfacing, how the backlog of road repair already exceeds $50 million there. We also hear Jack, our corrections director, talk about how the detention center has multiple deficiencies and some has to be fixed eventually with replacement, but even an immediate renovation are very costly. So we really have a lot of needs here, obviously fire station and other. The long-term request, that's another thing I want to mention, that at this point, if you look at the county's capital budget, anything beyond upcoming fiscal year, we carry another 5 year and even longer. Those are more wish list rather than reality, because typically what's put out there is 2 to 3 times what's reality what we can afford. That has been tradition there, at least in the past decade. And we have been talking about going forward. We really need to work with everybody, try to bring that down to more close to reality, and that's one thing we're going to work continuously with the new leadership. CIP funding issue, I think during the first meeting we talked a little bit, but not to dive into it. So traditionally, our capital budget are primarily funded through GO bond plus a couple other sources on that there. So we do have some self-imposed policy target, and with the current level of debt, and also the fact that we're doing a one-time big issuance and P3 for half year, we'll likely exceed that target for a short period of time for the foreseeable future. Our debt manager will talk more about that in And the other thing is that our annual debt service payment have been growing very fast as we continue to issue new bonds on that. And that unfortunately is taking more and more portion of any new revenue we have in any given year, because the more you have to spend on debt service payment, the less you're available for any other service that we have to address for our community. Part of that is also the capacity is already taken by existing debt authorized in the past, because years ago the county actually was less restrictive in terms of bond authorization. So today we're still going through the pipeline to issue some of bond authorized before, and that's also taking some of the capacity there. Other bonds, you probably already hear about that. We have transfer tax designated to our school capital project, recreation and parks project, and fire project, and also academic preservation, as well as house renew program on that, and also there's school surcharge and also the road excise tax. Unfortunately, when you look at those models, they're pretty much, most of them, their future capacity are largely exhausted by historical debt issues there. So meaning that it's not sustainable. Give you one example is about school surcharge. In fiscal 2005 and 2010, authorized school surcharge supported debt was $89 million. So with that level of debt, what's going to happen is that once you do that, you're counting on all future 20 years money to support that level of issuance. So meaning that the next 10 years, 20 years, you probably have $0 to support any new debt. Even in the future, you have new capital needs. So with that coupled with actual impact, which we're not going to talk in detail today because Thursday the actual consultant will be able to talk a little more. But with that, acknowledge the fact that some of the models actually are already showing deficits. For example, school surcharge. Even we don't have any new debt or new cash payment out of that funding source to support new school capital projects there. We're already likely to be in deficit in that fund 20 years from now, as high as $17 million in deficit. Road exercise, same story. Even if we do nothing, all the debt issued in the past, they're all authorized in the past, is going to make this fund in deficit. And some other transfer tax was left. It's very minimal, meaning that you can hardly do anything or only do a little bit in the next several years on that. So that's one thing about the planning as well. I think that's why I have been kind of advocating to the committee in the last couple of years. You really have to do multi-year projection, and you really have to look at financial sustainability. You cannot just say, okay, we do this debt and deplete all the future 20 years just for that one issue. We all have to look at the future needs as well and feed that into our policy making process. After talking about that, we can look at the tax burden and tax capacity. I think you're probably already aware of Howard County is it's really expensive. We have great services there, but really expensive to live. So we have second highest property tax rates in Maryland, including fire tax, and we are one of the 6 counties in Maryland already impose the highest income tax rate. So those are major tax burdens of the taxpayers, residents. So our tax burden is relatively high. It is true, there are some taxes that Howard County doesn't impose currently or not at a high end. These are representation tax, telephone tax, energy tax, we don't have that, and transfer tax, school surcharge, and road excise. We have that for CIP, but we're not at the high level compared to some other counties still. So here's a tax form that can give you a better idea. If we use median sales price and median household income as a base, then it shows clearly that if we just talk about absolute dollar value, the median household income are actually property income tax burden combined with a couple others. We are probably the highest income absolute dollar value. If you take that as a percentage of median income, then we are lower than Baltimore City and largely comparable with Montgomery County and Prince George's County. The next slide just shows some major tax rates comparison that shows real property tax, recordation tax, transfer tax, and the impact fees. The last column is school surcharge and road excise tax, which every county charged in a different way. Again, I think the county delegation is looking at some of the legislation, I don't know where we are on that, about changing potentially the surcharge fee on that there. But at this point, it's very hard to make apples to apples comparisons with that one. I think we're lower than those county currently. So that's just a quick snapshot, not too much good news to share on that there. Does anybody has questions before we kind of hand it over to our?
I did have one question back on slide 9 when you were referring to the debt. Do we have a metric that identifies the amount of runoff from debt expiration that's maintained, so where we know that rate of runoff from expiring debt?
Nikki, maybe when we do our debt manager talk about the debt issue, maybe hold a question on that and we can talk about it. Any other questions, or we can come back and talk about it?
Well, Holly, how often do the things that we recommend actually become reality? Are they adopted? Do we know? Does anybody have an idea?
Which one you were talking about?
Well, when we as a body make a recommendation, how often does it become a reality in the real world? It's been approved, it's been adopted.
A lot. Like, for example, if you talk about fire ambulance fee, the committee recommended for a couple of years on that, and the county then had consultant look into it, and we go to other counties to do a study. And actually, we're in the process to do a pre-file legislation on that there. And special events fee to recoup the overtime of our public safety for different events, that's already implemented.
Because my concern is, if we're looking at that shortfall, everything that has to be washed through the political arena, and this is, to me, in the first year, this is a huge issue.
Yeah, I think what's happening is the committee is very important in the sense that because this represents nonpartisan, independent voice. So I cannot speak for the leadership, but in general, the administration, wherever there is very sincerely looking into input and recommendations on that there. And obviously there will be other value judgments, there are other considerations there, but this is a very important committee and the recommendation will play an important role.
Could I add to that?
Yeah.
One of the things that in the last 2 years this committee started doing was trying to do more outreach at the community level, meeting with the Association of Community Services, the chamber presentation, and going out into the community, trying to present our recommendations and a snapshot of really what's going on, doing public education, which would help the political process and smooth some of the recommendations that we know have to happen. So I think if we can continue as this body to do that community education, I think it's huge.
I was going to add, I think also, I know for sure last year, I can't remember if we did it the year before, but the other thing I would say is sometimes in this group, some of the recommendations we would make were, I would say, not all, while we may have liked for them to be implemented, they weren't necessarily always made with the intention that they would be implemented, but rather to send a message that, look, this is important, this is of urgency, you really need to take a hard look at this. So as an example, like for instance, the annual GO bond authorization. So you see what the average has been. And last year, we had probably a good bit of discussion about that 75 to 90, in particular more on the 75 side. That was, I mean, we went probably, in some cases, a few million up or down and percentage on some other things. I can't remember maybe. See, but I know we talked a lot about on that lower end, trying to start coming back as opposed to continuing to average it at 92, 97. So sometimes it's a case of, I think in this group, we recognize the political side of it, but we say, okay, you know what, if we're doing our job is to make the recommendation and then let the various, bodies that be determine whether or not they want to accept it or what have you.
And two significant recommendations and additional recommendations that came out of the committee over the past few years One was a detailed look at the authorized but unissued bonds. It was a growing number that just continued to be out there, and we asked the county to step back and look at those and say, okay, what really needs to still be out there? I think at that time it was close to 400 million. Now it's down in the 250-ish or something like that. And then the other one is, it was on slide 7 that Holly had here, which was to start to look at that the gap that could grow with the way we looked at it. And that wasn't something that was looked at on a regular basis either, or at least it wasn't something that we saw. So at least gave us a little more view, but then gave the people who were making the decisions, it gave them a look to say, okay, if we make this decision, here's going to be that impact in a few years. So we're nibbling around the edges in these discussions, just trying to.
We can wave the flag, but if nobody's paying attention,
We've been waving the flag.
That's what I'm getting at.
There was one person who voted for 0 bond issuance last year. I can't remember who that was.
I remember exactly who it was.
But I have noticed it informs, and so it is valuable.
Well, no, I know it's valuable.
It's very much charter. It's just, that doesn't mean 100% implemented.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Now we're going to dive into all of our debt measures. So first, because there are a lot of new members, I'm going to go over the bond authorization and issues process because there's quite a lag between when the bonds are authorized and when we actually issue bonds. And then I'll go over the measures that are required by our current debt management policy. I'll go over some of the projections of where we think our debt measures will end up. We'll also go over some of the credit rating agency criteria. The county has been a AAA for over 20 years. It's something we're very proud of, and no one wants to see that go away. And then I'll also go over the, which we just started discussing, the authorized but unissued bonds. So first part is that when Holly and Budget introduces the capital budget, there's a lot of finagling, and then finally the bonds that are authorized match what is in the capital budget. And it would have to require legislation to move it to another project. It's all at the project level that it's tied to. The bond authorization is in effect for 4 years, but you are able to reauthorize the funds if it's not been spent yet. And generally what we see is that bonds are authorized up to 5 years after they are authorized on average. And here you can see that we kind of track how much is issued on an annual basis through the 5 years. So only about 10% in the first year, because a lot of that is just gearing up, getting the contracts ready and planning. And then the bulk of the work comes in the out years. We do have a line of credit in place because we actually fund our capital projects out of cash, and then do a draw request on our line of credit every other month. And then when we issue bonds, generally once a year, we'll pay off that line of credit with the general obligation bonds. So here is our first measure that's required by the debt management policy. So this is the outstanding debt as a percent of our assessable base. So you can see it's been fluctuating, but it did increase. It is a somewhat projection for 2019. We think it'll go up slightly. And so the county charter limits it to 4%. 4.8% of the assessed value. And this measure is also something that 2 of the credit rating agencies look at. So we do keep a close eye on this measure. Then we also look at debt as a per capita basis. The credit rating agencies don't look at it, but it is something that we're required to report to you annually. So you can see that between 2015 and where we see ourselves at the end of this fiscal year, it's increasing from about 30, just under 3,200 to 3,600. Our next debt measure is per capita debt as a percent of per capita income. So again, this one's not considered by the credit rating agencies, but we are required to report it to you. And so you can see that it's going up slightly between 2015 and where we expect to be at the end of 2019. And the final debt measure is debt service as a percent of current revenues. Our goal has been to keep debt service to 10% or less of current revenues. This measure is a part of Standard & Poor's credit rating agency criteria. And you can see that it was 8.72% at the end of fiscal year 2015. We expect it to be around 9% at the end of the current fiscal year. And then the way that we consider our revenue is we do include transfer tax, because transfer tax is not part of general fund. We use it to pay specific debt service for different projects. We also have an environmental services fund that has separate fees that we include in here, and also the fire tax that I'm sure you all see on your textbook. So then here are our projections of where we see ourselves going forward. Now, the assumptions that are included in these projections are about a $95 million annual debt issuance beginning in FY 2023. Because for the first 3 years, that's when we expect higher issuance as that authorized but unissued amount starts dwindling down. We estimate at 4.5% interest. We haven't paid that in quite a while, but we like to be conservative in our forecasting. And then you'll see that we also expect that the remaining $86 million of the courthouse bonds that were authorized would be issued in FY 2022. So you can see that we, as far as percent of the base, we expect it to go up a bit and then start declining as that authorized but unissued is finally issued, and then we'll have a smaller issuance going forward in the out years. Yep.
How much would the prison, the jail impact this if we think another $80 million? Significant.
Yep. Well, I take that back. It would not really, because I have something on the next.
Because it depends on, if we keep that under the overall assumption, 95 million, it was spread across several years, that's part of overall CIP, and it's only captured.
So it's captured.
It's only if it's on
If
top
it's
of
only
the
if it's on
ending,
top,
then
then
we'll have
it,
it.
so if it's in the 95, give or take, no change. If it's on above.
At this point, I mean, we're not likely to, courthouse is very unique because you only do it every 200 years. So we do it like it's very late, but we do it, maybe exceptions from that.
next time.
It's not likely to do another cost overall.
So Holly did ask me to look into if we assumed that the debt issuance was 90 or 85 million instead, a smaller amount. How would this affect the measures? And so actually, it's not that great of a difference. If we go all the way out to June 2029, if we issued only 85 million, continued to authorize and issue that number would go down to 1.79%. So it's not a huge decrease. And then this is the debt service projections for the revenues. And so you can see that here we see that it will go and exceed our self-imposed 10% cap. And part of that is back in December of 2017, the tax law changed, and it took away the county's ability to advance refund bonds. And so we have been taking full advantage of all of our refunding opportunities, and that's not something that we can factor in going forward unless the law changes again. And you can see that starting in like FY 2023, that's when the debt service from the courthouse and all the authorized but unissued bonds starts hitting us. And so following that, it starts to decline a bit.
Why was that authority removed?
That was the state, I mean, the federal tax law.
What was the income growth assumption for the revenue growth assumption, excuse me?
That's based on the most
The numbers you
projections and
provided.
plus on a couple
So
other.
that was roughly 3%?
Yeah, pretty much what
Yes.
so.
All right, thank you.
So part of the reason that it's expected to increase is, again, we're at the higher issuance amounts to, as the authorized but unissued bonds are dwindled down. The spike in FY 2022 from the milestone payment for the courthouse project. And our financial advisor, as long as we maintain our fund balances, which is another big issue with the credit rating agencies. If that remains consistent, then they don't anticipate a change to our credit rating. So then, possible relief. Is there a way that we could try to fund these and not kill ourselves, basically? So downtown Columbia district. So we did create a special taxing district as well as a development district. So included in that district is the area between Broken Land Parkway and the lake. I never say it quite right. And it's the area surrounding Meriwether and the Columbia Mall. And it's all the properties that are owned by the Howard Hughes Corporation and their affiliates. So our assessed value was frozen as of January 2015. And so any additional property tax revenues above that base, it's allocated to the debt service for the bonds that were issued to fund the roads in that area, which was about $48.3 million. And also set aside up to $30 million in GO bonds for an additional elementary school that'll be required for the expected students in that area. And then the remaining revenues will flow back to the county. And this is where we are trying to factor in projects that we know are going to be needed for the county and see what revenues we might be able to use to cover that outside of the general fund, so we would not need to increase property or income taxes possibly. So the fiscal projections that we included when we were looking into this was that we would include $30 million for a new fire station in the area, $40 million for a library, also an art center, a new transit center, and then of course we expect additional road improvements to be required because of the additional traffic. And so those, we think, the incremental property tax revenues could pay the GO bond debt service for those projects, so they would sort of not impact all these different debt measures. And just so far, we've used $175,000 of those incremental revenues that have come in to pay for some fire equipment for, they needed some taller ladder trucks because of the taller size of the buildings. So then, Moody's and S&P consider the county's outstanding debt as a percent of revenues. The county currently falls in the single A category, not the triple A category, and because we're in between 60 to 120%. So you can see here that our outstanding GO debt in 2015 was about 84%. We expect to go up to as high as 105%, and then drop back down. So we'll stay within the 60 to 120% range. So that's a good sign.
And they only look at the go bond, so if you have this, what you talked about on the previous slide, those are not included, any debt issuance related to the development district are not included in that bucket.
Right, if they look at, if it's a self-sustaining revenue, that, that we would not have to rely on the general fund, yes, that falls outside of this. So then this is the fund balance that I had mentioned. So Moody's, you can look at, we're currently in the single A category there as well, between 15 and 5%. To be triple A in the fund balance category with Moody's, we would need to have set aside 30% of our revenues. And historically, the county has felt that there are a lot of other uses other than just setting money aside that we could be using on an ongoing basis. And you can see that within Maryland counties, we have historically a lower fund balance than AAA counties nationwide. Places like Alaska, they have a lot of oil income that they can set aside those revenues. So even Montgomery County, the other counties around, they have slightly lower, well not slightly, but they have lower. S&P, on the other hand, we're considered strong, which is more like the AA category, and they don't expect quite as much in fund balances. And also, I just wanted to point out that the, and of course, one of them was to maintain the AAA rating, and also look at our rainy day fund, because we had started to try to set aside more than our charter mandated 7%. So we are working towards increasing that in the out years in case of a downturn in the economy. So then we also did a comparison to other peer, well, not peer, but neighboring counties. Not all of these are AAA rated, but you can see that we're sort of right on the cusp of the 15%. Charles County has over 25%. So we just want to see where we are in comparison. And then these are just some of the comments from our different credit rating agencies. You can see here that we do plan to increase the reserve to 3%, so that overall this 3 plus the 7 would then give us a 10% fund balance. And here's the authorized but unissued bonds. So you can see that when you included all of the authorized but unissued, not just the general obligation bonds, we were close to $1 billion back in FY 2016. We anticipate that in FY 2020 we'll be at 700,000. So we're trying to slowly whittle that down through budgetary and legislative processes. So we've really, last year we did a deep dive with all the departments to see if there was anything that they didn't need from the authorized bonds, and then through the budget process we are just not reauthorizing those or deauthorizing those. So trying to get a handle on that number.
And you particularly put up the GEO bonds piece here, a few years ago, it was $264 million, that dropped all the way to more than 200.
And then if you look at just also trends, on average, the amount that we issue in relation to the authorized amount is less than. Right now we're at 90% average of the amount of authorized bonds that are actually issued. presentation. Anyone has any questions? Yes?
Debt as a percentage of assessable base early on, you said we cap it at 4.8%. Have we ever gone towards 4.8%, and what was the economic impact if we did?
We have not ever gone anywhere near 4.8%, because we're more limited by our debt service as a percent of our revenues than we are from our assessable base. We have a quite healthy assessable base in Howard County, so I wouldn't anticipate that we would get closer to that because of the revenue cap.
Okay, thank you.
Before.
But on an annual basis, we're growing our debt at a higher rate than we're growing our revenues.
So,
And we're growing our revenues projected less than 3%, we're growing our debt 4 to 5% a year.
more than 8 to 10%.
Oh, 8 to 10% a year, okay. And then in 1 year, we're even bigger because of the holdouts.
So that's eating to whatever the new revenues, higher insurance, and that's what.
Thank you very much, Nikki.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we're missing, we have 9 days to turn in a report. We've lost a week because of the snow. We started a week later than we have in previous years, so we're a little bit behind. A group of us got together on Friday last week for a few hours just to start to talk about putting together the written reports so we can get a draft out to the committee probably over the weekend, this weekend. We've got our meeting on Thursday night to talk about the AFCO financial projection impact recommendations from the consultant that are going to come in. I put this together. These are the 4 things that, you know, we're asked to do if you look back at the charge of the committee. Recommend on the projections of revenue for the upcoming fiscal year, recommended level of debt for new debt authorization, anticipated effect of the committee's budget recommendations on future budgets, and other findings and/or recommendations that the committee deems appropriate. So those are kind of, you know, that's our charge. In previous years, what we've done is we've talked about where we think the projection of revenue is. As you saw what Holly put together, you saw what Dr. Quince put together today. You know, Holly's recommendation is 2.7% revenue growth for fiscal year 2020, about $30 million. Then we need to talk about a recommended level of debt authorization. So, you know, bond recommendation, authorization, you know, 70 million, 80 million, 90 million. You know, what's the committee comfortable with from their report? As you saw, unauthorized bonds issued is approximately 2.5 times the annual request. That's not the right sentence. It's supposed to say the request for 2.5 times the annual authorization. It's 232 million. Is that what it was this year? Is the request? So we should talk about these 2 first, and then we can go to the next one. So from a revenue forecast, how's everybody feeling about the 2.7% based on the 2 presentations we had this morning?
So by the way, I mean, just for everybody's information, since we include the committee members, so we usually discuss and kind of have a, not very formal, but vote to make sure that anything we put in the recommendation or the key recommendation gets the buy-in of the majority of the committee. So the first one is on the revenue forecast. So basically, Steve was asked, like, is everybody comfortable with the budget projection? Do you have any question or recommend a different percentages?
I think one point that we have to emphasize, the county is required to have a balanced budget, right?
Correct, yes. Actually, not like federal government, local governments usually have to have. Yes, we have to have.
Except local governments get to put the unbalanced part in their CIP budget, and the federal government doesn't. So if you look at the 30 million, what was the current gap? And to your point earlier, I've never seen a number that big in the gap piece in any of the discussions I'm having. Obviously, the county and the school board are having some conversations about what that ultimately will be. I guess, when does the school board meet?
Tonight.
Tonight?
At 4 o'clock.
Yeah, it's the hard part of our job is we have to have a report done by next week when we're in the middle of all the other decisions that can take a little bit longer. That recommendation assumes no changes to any revenue sources. There wouldn't be any changes to 2020 revenue sources. We'd only be able to change at this point 2021, right?
Is
So,
that why 20?
so you've got, you know, based on current legislation, current, you know, $30 million.
If anything, I think 2.7 is probably optimistic. Just from what Dr. Quinn said, and, you know, we might have had a very optimistic January economically, but we had a really bad December, and a lot of the economic trends from December have come through. We're now seeing the stats from that, where consumer confidence, retail sales, and all these things are dramatically down. So, and then we have the 35-day shutdown, which who knows, I'm fairly confident that was not put into this forecast, but 35-day shutdown where we have a lot of contractors and a lot of federal government workers. Of course, some of them got back pay, not all of them did. And how those financial decisions they make going forward impact their spending decisions for the rest of the year. You know, I don't know if 2.7% adequately grasps the precipice that we're on, but maybe I'm just a half-empty glass.
Well, I guess it's, and I might be using the term wrong, you have to tell me, but do we know what the flexibility is with our citizens as far as how much debt they're carrying, how much, you know, we can look at the numbers of what we need to make it work, but if they can't afford to pay for it, what is their ability, or do we have any idea?
Nobody really knows the kind of, I mean, if you talk about consumer debt relative
Yeah, like
to
if
income.
they're, you know, if they're running hot and there's not much to play with, we can't necessarily say, well, we need $1,000 per person to,
Well, that comes off the income account, so there would be de-linked. And no, nobody really knows at the county level what the consumer debt burden is that I know.
And the only, I mean, other than additional fees or other types of things, and some of those are listed in the additional recommendations, the only lever the county can pull without state intervention is property taxes. And we're already at the statutory limit for income tax at the 3.2%. So we don't know any higher we can go there. The only thing we can do is go property tax, and you go back to the slide Holly put and shows that we're, you know, the number 2 jurisdiction in the state of Maryland's percentage of income.
So it's kind of like, as you pointed out there, whoever decision makers, they have to weigh all those needs, so you have to balance the needs of the community for service, but also balance the tax burden at the same time, which is not.
and that's what I'm getting at, it doesn't look like we have much leeway in anything, given what being projected.
Well, that's where you have the, you know, if your revenues are going up 3% a year, but your debt's growing at a greater percentage, something has to give at some point.
Right.
I was on the committee right after the Great Recession, and it wasn't as dire as the conversations we're having right now from where we are on the fiscal impact.
And does that 2.7 in terms of property tax contemplate APFO? Do you have any sense of what that?
The fiscal 20 actual impact, the amendment hasn't kicked in yet. So the actual impact is more long-term, it's not really long-term, like medium-term on that, so it's probably fiscal year, it's calendar year 2022. Before that, actually, we did see the permitting already slow down a little bit, maybe because they're already anticipate of that, they already started to take action, but it's not that dramatic impact, it's more a few years down the road, we're gonna see it all again.
But do you think there'd be a rush to bill anticipating that?
I would think that would be happening right now, and it's just, it's not happening at that
It's
level.
actually, it seems to actually slow down a little bit. Jeff, do you have any?
Yeah, it is slowing down. I think because of anticipation of the change in the APO in part. And then the other reason is just one of the things to keep in mind is that things are going to be slowing down because of the APO amendments unless something changes through either a change in the law or a redistricting that the school's talking about. But the long-term reduction of growth in the future is going to be a natural trend anyways because of the amount of land is running out in the county. So this is a good conversation to have, that over the medium to long term, growth will be slowing down based on current land use policy.
Good question, Holly. I know that you had, Richard, were doing a slowdown alternative. Does that change the revenue forecast?
We actually already using a push of that. So what happens is, kind of, Josh was right to point it out, there's a lot of uncertainties now. So in FY '20, we actually used one quarter, the last quarter of fiscal year '20, which is basically the second quarter of that calendar year. Next calendar year, we'll see some impact from economic downturn or slowdown on that. So we did view, but that's because at the tail end of FY '20, that's why you don't see significant impact there. So but we did kind of moderate that a little bit. And we're thinking actually FY '21 will be more likely to be the year if the economy does see the downturn. That's the time we'll probably see more significant impact there.
I would only argue that perhaps, if you look at those 2 years of FY '20 and FY '21, that's sort of, I won't say it's one continuous, but maybe shifting some of the, right now it might be good, it might be 3/4 of a good year, maybe slowing our spending down a little bit and putting some more into the rainy day fund, so that when in FY '21, if we do have more of a significant slowdown, we're not having to have a
That's a really good point.
a sharper drop off in our revenue or
Yeah.
ability to spend.
Yeah, I think that's a good planning. There's a couple of things that makes a lot of sense to me. One is that you cannot just focus on the immediate future. You have to look a little bit beyond that to get us prepared. Some of the things maybe you slow down or avoid putting into the base, and next year you find it's very difficult to fund. The second part is looking at the fund balance piece on that there, because a lot of the other jurisdictions actually come back from a couple of meetings or conference where everybody, not only here but all the other states, are talking about one of the very effective ways is try to use some fund balance there, because if things does happen, it really could be very dramatic. To avoid cutting your service right away, you get a little bit cushion to make things smooth.
There's a lot of discussion regarding the rainy day fund. Can you please provide some perspective as to the restrictions on using the rainy day fund and what those would be?
7% of rainy day fund is charter mandated. The general fund, we have to keep 7% in the rainy day fund. There is, according to the charter, you can use it for emergency, but you have to replenish that in the next couple of years on that there. On the policy side there's a lot of implications there. One is rating, for the fund rating agencies there, they already alluded there, and I think we need to mention that to some other jurisdictions, our fund balance is not as strong as it could be, and our financial advisor already made a recommendation to grow more fund balance on top of the rainy day fund. The second thing is that if you dip into rainy day fund for one-time usage there, you still have to pay it back, meaning next year's new revenue, you have to allocate some of that to that. So it's kind of you loan it from yourself. And also, you can only use for one time based on the charter. The use of fund balance has to be used for one time, not for ongoing type of expenditure. So if you use for personnel, for example, then next year, those are recurring expenditures.
So then that goes to your point about the policy as to whether or not you put it in the fund balance, you keep it in the fund balance for just the rainy day, correct?
The rainy fund is mandates on that. And when we closed the cap for last year, I think we have about $7 million unassigned fund balance on top of the rainy day fund on that there. The rest of the fund balance are either assigned or committed. For example, you already have the income, the PO, etc. So it looks like it's part of fund balance, but you actually already have other usage for that. So to be honest, there, if we only have that much above rainy fund, it's actually of a concern, meaning that we don't have too much leverage. If we do have either economic or federal policy shock or other things on that there. And that's why the reason that financial advice has been proposing, and we kind of agree on in the next several years, we really start the fund balance, but in particular in light of the potential economic recession. That's important to look at.
As people are starting to grumble about the new tax plan that we have in place now that they're just filing under for 2018, with one of the limitations being the change in how you address property tax, are we forecasting or expecting to see any impact in the builder's inventory as to how they're going to change their inventories in the county with regards to how the impact will be with the cap on property tax reduction?
I'm sorry, are you talking about, just to clarify, are you talking about what is the potential change of property tax on developers or?
No, so essentially the property tax got kept, was it $10,000 or so on the property tax? So therefore, inventory, like as it's moving further west in the county and the larger homes like MD, Toll Brothers and some of those that are building some of the larger homes, they may start changing their inventories as to pull back some of that because of the fact that those the property taxes exceed what's going to be deductible and what you're going to be able to claim at this point under the tax law. So are we forecasting any changes in maybe a slowdown in some of the larger single-family homes that picked back up after we came out of the economic downturn in the housing market?
Yes, we actually are projecting after that things are slowed down a little bit on that.
Because if those start to come down, that's a huge percentage change and that's gonna be a greater impact, obviously, if those larger property tax dollars start to decrease rather quickly.
If you go to Holly's slide on, in her presentation, which is tax burden. So right now, the total tax burden on average, including property and income tax, is just below that $10,000 cap for Howard County. That doesn't even include the state tax we're paying.
Right.
So your average Howard County resident is already capped out at the $10,000. So there doesn't your end, the people at the end of the spectrum are capped out, and the people at the lower end of the spectrum are now experiencing some. So even somebody who's buying a average home in Howard County is going to be capped out where they weren't before. So it could have an impact on the lower end more significantly than it has an impact on the higher end.
Exactly. So if we forecast in what we suspect might be a change in inventory as to what's being built and how fast the property tax or maintaining the property tax revenue would be, given that might be a consideration for buyers going forward.
Yeah, that is a good point. I wouldn't say we quantify that specific factors impact. If we look at the overall trend, we have been adjusted down from modified compared to last year. In general, anticipating all those risk factors on that. So I would say we accounted for that, but not necessarily in that particular quantifier way for that specific factor. But these are good points.
That's just
very good
bringing it up and then realizing that it impacts the entire spectrum, especially the lower end of the spectrum where we probably weren't even thinking about that.
Well, it probably just hastens the trends that Richard was saying,
Yeah.
where you have upper income people leaving the county.
Yeah.
So if you're a retiree or about to retire, why would you stick around when you're going to be dinged an extra $5,000–6,000 off of your taxes?
Move to no income tax state.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the economics of this would be a deceleration of growth in property values. So are we going to have less development because of the federal tax law? Probably not, because we're slowing, the more binding constraints, we don't have land anymore. So will there be on the margin? Yes. So then what you're going to see is as people, what people care about is after-tax cost of housing. So as they can deduct less, it'll get baked into the acceleration of property values. So we can expect the economics, this would be a slower growth in property values than we would see in the absence of the tax. I don't think we're going to see a wholesale shift in inventory because we're inventory constrained. And the more binding changes in inventory for income projections are the transition from single-family houses to the multifamily townhouse, condo which are gonna have a bigger impact on aggregate property, aggregate incomes in the county anyway.
So not to get too far afield from the revenue question, but what you're saying is that we'll have a weird impact on the cost side of housing, even though the demand will still be there.
Because we're supply constrained, what's gonna happen is, in the absence of this federal tax law change, what I think it says is more caution, because in the future, whatever the past predictions for property tax increases will be lower because of the federal tax law change. So that points to, I think, a good point is another reason for to go into slow growth, because not only do we have slower income growth, lower population growth, but as a result of federal tax law changes, can expect to see slower property tax growth. So I never thought of that till now, but
Yeah.
I think this points to the fact we have to say something that the county has to keep. The revenues are only going to grow 3%. The current requests are on the order of 15% increase, right?
The other thing is that, again, that's not, I'm sorry, it's not Tony now, I was going to jump to the multi objection thing. Apple, all this multi objection impacting Apple.
So I'm hearing, from Josh here to maybe soften the 2.7% a little bit. Does anybody have a recommendation that we could, as a group, vote on?
I'd go 2.5.
Throwing numbers out there on 2.5, but, I mean, I don't know, 2.7 seems to be what Richard had done kind of scientifically.
So would
But I
it be
think
better
it's lower than,
to say it's 2.7 because we're so close to where it is, but that we recommend that some of those proceeds be used to put away into for future out years? So don't spend the 30 million.
So I tend to agree with what Josh is saying from the standpoint of applying a little bit more conservatism. I don't have a way of identifying what that number would be, but I do think that 2.7 to me appears to be a little bit more optimistic than I would think.
I think the 2.7 represents how you have already backed off on the actual, what their original. I thought your projection was something like 3.2 and you backing off 2.7 to cover for the last quarter of the fiscal year.
Yeah, we kind of, yes, that's already factoring. Some assume this will down in the last quarter of fiscal year 20. So that's, so the projection will represent already factoring some of the stuff. I think the question is whether that's sufficient for the school. From our perspective, we are comfortable with the number put there. Based on what we know at this point, we did already factor in the slowdown, and we did factor in some potential shutdown impact as well on that.
Okay, so if we've already factored in some potential shutdowns, so I guess, Josh, what else are we factoring in here then?
well, I think general slowdown in the economy in 2019, going into 2020. As I think Garnett said, or I forgot who it was, but building in caution now makes out years easier to handle. And I think everything that we're hearing compounds to the fact that the out years are going to be more difficult than what we're even facing right now. So if we do stay at 2.7, I think what Steve said, just do not build in some surplus for 2020, 2021, 2022, where the bite of AFCO is going to hit. We don't yet know how the income tax, the SALT deduction is going to play in. And then you just have a slowing economy generally at the end of the cycle. We're also at full employment. We're not seeing the wage growth at full employment that you typically see. I don't think that's a Howard County problem. I think that's a national, globalized economy problem. But we're just not seeing the wage growth. And we're seeing some of our wealthiest residents leave and replaced by younger families that aren't at the income scale that they were. So we have a lot of trends working against us. And the council's going to end up making political decisions. Everybody ran promising new stuff.
Charge!
My only question was, is that given some of the factors that we've already made in coming up with this 2.7, I want our number to be relevant,
Right.
and not sky is falling.
Right, and I think there has to be some pessimism going forward,
Right.
right? But if we say 30 million, they're gonna make political decisions to get themselves 50 million. And at some point, knowing what we know, we want them to say, well, 35 million, or understanding that they have their own political considerations.
So, I'm just listening to the room, it sounds like, other than maybe having some language in there that points out what's out on the horizon, I mean, 2.5%, we're gonna be at, 20.5, so it's gonna be so close anyway. Is everybody comfortable going with the 2.7, but having some language in the report to talk about that need for fiscal restraint because of what could happen in the next few years?
I would agree with that, but I do have one question. Even as we make recommendations, is there an area in the report that allows a narrative about concerns? Exactly, is that to be included?
Yeah, we'll put that in that recommendation. And then when everybody reads it, they can, comment at that point. Do we need to, do we want to have a vote on
Yeah,
that?
so we.
Everybody comfortable with that?
So it's the 2.7% plus the language.
Yeah.
How many people will be on that? But can people raise their hands and we can come quickly? And Raul, can you call me? And how many people, is anybody coming who are against it on that? Don't have it. Okay, so that appears to be fine.
It's not that I'm for it, but I have no basis other than saying, wow, this doesn't look good at all.
Got it. So we'll put it in also with the analysis on that.
Yeah, so then our next charge is on recommendation for bond issuance, or authorization, I should say. As we can see in the previous slide, issuance is based on previously authorized and the needs as the project moves through. So, in previous years, we've been 80, 85, 90, 75. So I just threw some numbers up there as kind of to get everybody thinking about their thoughts on the recommendation. I would say for me, listening to Nikki's presentation and seeing that kind of shift between our out-year growth and our out-year growth in debt versus revenue is pretty sobering, so. Anybody have any initial observations? Go
Can I
ahead.
just make a quick comment?
Uh-huh.
So you're saying last year's bond authorization was 97, but actually it was 116, and they de-appropriated some courthouse prior year funding. So new appropriation is 116, not 97.
I thought that,
But I think all this comes to excluding the.
I thought the authorized, this was excluding courthouse.
No, I get what you're saying, but new authorization, if you look at last year's budget, was 116 million.
The net total.
Net was 97.
Yeah, the net total, because in any year, sometime we deauthorize some prior, or we close some project, or make a just done, and then add new. So the total increase, the total new, we only look at the bottom line, is 97.
What was the total authorization then?
That's total.
It was 116. That's a net figure.
No. In the budget, if you look at the budget book, that's 97 million.
If you look at the
97 million
net.
is if you look at the capital budget book, because in the budget
Was the
book.
was the
it's a
difference
total.
previously authorized and
The difference is that in the capital budget, we can show deauthorization, but we do not have a legal mechanism in our code to deauthorize the authorization. So, but you can't spend the money because you don't have the capital budget appropriation anymore. So that's the difference between the 116 and the 97.
Yeah, all I'm saying is, as far as the FY19 capital budget, new authorization was 116 million, not 97 million.
So it was,
No, it is 97 million.
so it was 41 million above our record.
No, that's not correct. It is 97 million, the total capital budget authorized based on the budget book, that's the total.
I guess, if I may.
It's a bond authorizing legislation versus what's in the budget book, bond, the difference is, as Nikki said, there's a separate legislation to make sure you can issue the bond, to make sure, and that one, they didn't count on the deauthorized part on that. For our capital
So
budget
just-
book, we include both.
Just so I can bring it down to my level, we had $97 million of
Total.
new bond authorization
Correct.
and $20 million of reauthorization of previously authorized bonds.
The other 20 million was just a reallocation between capital projects.
I vote 75.
But, well, let me catch up then. What does that, Craig, what does that do then?
It doesn't do anything on what you guys want to vote on.
Yeah, it's just, it basically, but it changes how much is outstanding, right?
And that's
Well,
true.
No, no, no.
That doesn't change what's outstanding.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
You
No,
only-
no.
Outstanding is
I
whatever's
need to
issued.
clarify,
Right.
yeah.
I'm,
The
all, my
total
point
increase.
is, all my point was your, what
We
was,
deauthorized.
what came through on the actual capital budget, if you just look at the positive side, was 100 and, well, I lost the number, 13 million.
16.
Not 16 million, not 97 million.
And what Ollie's saying is that the 97 was the net.
That's the net,
Correct.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Because we add
exactly.
that and we reduced some others there.
Right.
So the
But-
total increase that year is 97.
But but how much do you believe that you will be issuing in fiscal year 2019?
What's it, that's a very different question. The issuance
Right.
go back to the prior
I understand.
authorized.
I understand, but how much do you think you're going to be issuing?
And these
I
days,
see
we
120
actually
million in here.
140 to
Mhm.
more
Yeah.
million, because we still catch up historical,
Yeah.
Mhm.
historical
Eating
numbers.
away at the 230 million.
Yes.
Correct.
Previously
That's
authorized.
right.
Yes. For the authorization that was approved for the current fiscal year, 2019, you said how much was that?
97.
97. And you know the percentage of that was a percentage of that earmarked for schools?
Yes. I think 40-some million dollars.
The question I have is that we need to factor, I think we need to factor in that X a percentage of the capital, of the bond, of the authorization is going to go for schools anyway. So how much more do we want for those other capital, those CIP requests?
So the question is, so are you, so are you asking the committee to discuss the pushing?
No, I'm just saying that when we set our number, we need to keep in mind that there's going to be a certain percentage that can go for schools anyway. We also have other capital needs.
Correct.
And so we need to factor some kind of way in not knowing the numbers, but think about that also.
Well, we know that it's $232 million and 70 of it is
70
the
is the
schools.
school, the rest of other is, I think the
Right.
community college is more
160
than
million
10
for everything else.
And then the rest is everything.
Is that after stated facility?
So that's then, the rest is all other things.
Well, so for me, given what we saw earlier today in the presentation, I don't know how any of these numbers impact all those numbers. And I know we only got 9 days to deal with this, but I don't know what those options cause for our rating, for anything moving forward.
Well, Nikki, in your presentation, you felt comfortable
With 95.
with 95 on a go-forward basis.
Correct.
It's already factored in, right? That's what was in your
Correct.
projections?
And we went over AAA in one sense, was it the 10%? We went over 10%.
That's a self-imposed debt management policy. That's not,
That's
not
not-
by the credit rating agencies.
The the total assessable base to debt and the total debt to total revenues, that's something the rating agencies look at?
They look at the, more the assessable base, correct.
Also, just to make things more interesting, the higher the bond, the higher the authorization of the bond, the more it eats into that $30 million because the bond payments are paid out of operating, right?
Yeah, but it won't eat into it until 2021, right?
At the
So
earliest.
one thing is that, first of all, it does transfer to the debt service part in the operating budget. So that's the direct relationship. The second thing, as they mentioned earlier, the decision made for FY '20 is not going to just impact FY '20, but also multiple years. Because thinking how the historical information usually takes a few years to issue what's in authorized indebted because the actual time of construction and the cash flow.
So everything you presented on your slide that showed the gap we have to fund, the $11 billion in bond payments is not something that can be squeezed down. That's 30% of that growth is going to be eaten up with bond payments because of this.
Yeah.
So really it's only 20 million for everything else. And if we're saying there needs to be fiscal restraint, that means there's maybe 10 million to 15 million for everything else.
Right.
Well, to complicate things even further, I think part of the challenge is, and I look back at what the committee has issued in the past, is we're making a basic recommendation, okay, 70 million, 80 million, whatever it is, but we're not getting to any level of specificity, then we can this is whether we should or should not, as to how these bonds should be issued. We have scarce resources. The needs of the county are changing. As the demographics of the county change, we're going to have to increase services both on the county side as well as the school system side. So our needs continue to go up. So the question then becomes, when we do issue bonds, should there be a priority or some sort of checklist as to how we decide how they should be issued? Because I can speak from the school system perspective, which is we physically need more schools. Our number of students are going up and we're going to need more schools. So if we're not going to be putting the money into that, see what I'm saying, is then where in the county do we put those resources?
At the same time when the doors are rusting off the prison.
Exactly, exactly, I'm not saying that.
No, I'm saying, I'm just saying,
Right.
that's something to remember.
That's not our charge though. Like, our charge is to just give them a number that is based in some reality. And then the council, has to put together the budget from that number, the actual allocations.
So just so you know, it's the county executive that puts the budget.
Right, well, I mean, that means but making the political calls and approving the budget at the end of the day, the council does that, and then the executive will present his budget.
Well, how do we give them a number with regards, we've sat through all these, and this is my first year, so I'm just asking. We've sat through all these presentations, the agencies came in and made their pitch for the things that they thought they needed. We've added that number up, come up with a total, and now we're talking about how much of that total we want to go through the bond. We haven't discussed really whether or not this is a priority, that's a priority. I mean, my question is like the prisons, like you said, with the prisons, when they came in, when the corrections agency came in, they laid out the things that they thought were priorities. And it was interesting because one of the things they didn't lay out a cost for was the garbage cans they've got all over the prisons catching water. And to me, if you've got a water penetration situation in a facility, the word mold in Howard County has been like kryptonite. So I'm going, okay, this isn't something that they even asked for funding for, but I'm like, how do you, I mean, granted, I want the doors to stay closed, I don't want the prison doors to be popping open, but at the same time, we've got employees in there as well as...
No, I totally agree, it's just, this committee can't get into the details of how to spend it, we just have to give the broad strokes and let them work it out. You know, if the executive and the council want to spend all the money on the prison, that's their will to do it, we just have to tell them what the parameters that they're playing in.
But we don't think what we...
We can say that, like, this
They
is...
could have mailed in their total dollar amount, and we could have got straight to this point then. If we're not gonna say, you know, well, hey,
Yeah,
how
but
about
I'm
this?
saying, we're not gonna say, give $20 million to the prison. We can't, that's not
But I think
our...
what we can say is
We would
that
say it's a priority, we just...
in light of the fiscal constraints and unidentified future bonding needs, i.e. the prison, we suggest reducing current issuance to some level, be it 70, be it 0, be it, whatever. So I think we can put that kind of language in saying, I think further restraint in issuance this year is called for, A, because of the economic slowdown, and B, because of these unmet capital needs that aren't in this plan.
I just don't know how to allocate money or vote on how much I want to agree to, if I'm not sure which items we're funding, which ones. Are we funding the new police, the fire stations, the EMS services, or the roof, or the prison doors? I don't know whether it's 70 million, 80 million, or 90 million on the recommendation.
Our charge is, what can the county afford to fund?
Right.
Exactly. We
Not
don't
what
get
the
into-
county should.
Could we break it out a little more in our recommendations, and if we go with that 30 million, 11 million of that is accounted. So it's not 30 million.
So,
You know what I'm saying?
I think as we craft it, we need to put that
In
language.
the-
And that's what I'm getting at, be very specific as to what they are actually playing with.
in the past, when you justify some of the levels that we've had, then we explain that these are challenges that are coming forward. And so that the council has to take that into consideration. You know, if we're saying, let's just say for the sake of argument, we choose 70 million, and we put in there a comment that we have these capital needs for highways and bridges, I mean, for infrastructure repair and the prison and so forth, that they have to keep that on their radar. But they also have to be fiscally responsible on it too.
I recommend, I mean, to your point, one recommendation is, we've talked about it kind of around the edges for a number of years, is having a better long-term plan, right? We know we're gonna spend X, and we know we're gonna spend it on this each year because we have to catch up these deficits within the county. And then that kind of gets rid of well, what are we spending money on? Why are we talking about it every year that it's gonna be this or it's gonna be that? We know what we have out there. What if we put together a long-range plan that says, this is what we're gonna do over the next 10 years?
Because that's what we have in the courthouse.
Yeah, I mean, well, look.
If we had.
The courthouse come up because, you know, it had been almost 200 years, and it was one of those things where if you don't do it, you're gonna start getting penalties from the government, from the federal government. It's like, well, I guess this is kind of we have to. But I don't disagree with what you're saying, because it's frustrating, but from an affordability standpoint, as we look at it, how much can the county afford?
I think to summarize all those other points there, I think the committee's charged more about affordability and things that people should want to put in the narratives to pay attention, and any policy or process change, you cannot be overly prescriptive to say how much percentage allocated, that's not, it's really, that's kind of like a little bit wrong.
So my recommendation is, we're at 9 o'clock now, we're getting together again Thursday night. We're gonna hear from the FO, so if everybody could think about this piece, also think about the future budget based on those discussions. We started talking about that a little bit, and then start to think about any other findings, recommendations. That can be a catch-all for some of these other discussions that we're having around things we would recommend that the county look into.
do we ever put in scenarios, like, okay, if we make a recommendation of 70 million, here's what that looks like, or versus a $90 million bond scenario, so that there's some evaluative ability for people reading the report, like, oh, now that I know the difference between the two, here's what I can decide on.
You could do that. The struggle we have there with those pieces is that the difference between what the recommendation is to the authorization, right? There's already $223 million of authorized unissued bonds that could be issued tomorrow if you know, the group wanted to do, not this group, but the county wanted to do that. So this just adds to that bucket,
Okay.
which is why last year, my recommendation was 0.
So
There's already $230 million out there of things and projects that are in the pipeline. Use that up first, but that was just me being.
I'd like to recommend to the new folks that the first 11 pages of the report last year have all the recommendations, and then the rest of it is all the data that Dr. Clinch has put in and so forth. So if you read those, I think it makes it easier to see how you kind of shape it at the end of the day. And it's pretty easy reading. Should be, it's in your.
It's in the Dropbox.
Steve,
Yeah, you put this is.
Yeah,
Is
this
it-
is in the Dropbox, but we'll double check. And also there's last year's report as well.
But we should be clear, I mean, this is this committee's report. Last year's is there as a good guide of, hey, here's what people have done, but it's this committee's report on what we want to recommend. And it can be changed and adjusted for those things.
So given the time, I think even the debt probably will go into Thursday the committee will make more decision regarding what kind of condition we'll be putting in every year. And
And
I'll,
then 7 to 9.
7 to 9, say,
Yeah.
9 to 9.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
But here.
Here, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.